Why do some innovations change the world while others collect dust in a lab? The answer isn't better technology, it's better communication. The most successful research projects share one thing in common. They identify their audience before they perfect their product. Today, you'll learn a proven framework for mapping your stakeholders, finding your customers, and crafting messages that actually resonate.
My name is Becky Duffy. Why am I here to talk to you today? Well, I am a marketing and engagement professional who has spent the last 25 years of my career working in and with new ventures. And in that time, I've had the privilege of being able to develop some quite significant brands here in New Zealand and some smaller ones as well that have come out of tech transfer offices. So you can see a couple of those brands that I've been working with over the years down on the right-hand panel there of this slide. I personally commercialised multiple products as well as led several deals, including a significant exit for one of New Zealand's state-owned enterprises. I spent 5 years working in research commercialisation at Wellington Univentures, which is part of Victoria University of Wellington. I'm the co-founder of Campus Plus New Zealand, and I'm really stoked to be with you guys today. So after today, there's a number of key learning outcomes that we're aiming to get through with you guys. So after today, you will understand the difference between a stakeholder, a customer, and your wider audiences, and you'll understand how to identify them. Really important. You've got to understand why you want to identify them. Why is that important? And we'll also talk about completing an audience matrix for your research or your project or your venture, depending where you are on that commercialization journey. I will also look at messaging and understanding why this is important. As Holly mentioned earlier, I was unwell and couldn't do this webinar when it was in sequence, and subsequently we've had a deeper dive into value prop. We've had a webinar by Jonathan Wally on the 6th of June. So I'd encourage you, if you really are keen on finding out more and you missed Jonathan's webinar, to go back and have a look at that. And at its most basic, today's webinar is really for anyone who's interested in good communication by identifying who needs to know what they're up to. So who needs to know what you are doing? So this is for researchers. This is for anyone involved in driving a new venture, anyone involved in commercialization, including commercialization professionals. And it might be some stuff in here that might even be handy in your personal life. Let's see. I'm going to give you some high-level examples to illustrate my point, and it will dive into a specific case study further on into the presentation, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. Okay, so who's got an interest in what you're up to? The recent Netflix show Baby Reindeer is a good example of knowing who your stakeholders, customers, and audiences are, and sometimes how it's not quite as simple as it might appear on the face of it. So for those of you who have been living under a rock, Baby Reindeer was touted as a true story about extreme stalking, and it dropped in April this year. So we might have viewers, the subscribers, obviously, advertisers could be in the mix there. Competitors will be watching what Netflix is up to, and so will their investors. So in a classic case of if you build it, they will come, the popularity of this show spawned a group of very engaged audience members that reassigned themselves as stakeholders and started sleuthing the internet to try and find the real life people that were represented by the characters in the show. If you had been online as the show dropped, you'll see that they threw up a whole bunch of additional audience groups in the process of trying to find out who these characters were. And those audience groups were probably not on Netflix's original stakeholder matrix. So they had things like, obviously the keyboard warriors got involved, private investigators got in the mix pretty early on to try and understand who these characters were. The media were all over it. Police got involved because there were some quite nasty allegations flying around. It was even discussed in the UK government select committee around some of the implications of this show and lack of privacy. And just a couple of weeks ago, a court case was lodged in California against Netflix by one of the real life characters in the show. So this was a PR nightmare, which we're not here to discuss. But I wanted to give you an example of how an audience mix can be really broad, complex, and sometimes out of your control, as much as you'd like it to be in your control. So let's bring the conversation back to a world that we're more familiar with and look at some more generic examples of not understanding your stakeholders, customers, or audience groups, and how not communicating with them appropriately can lead to some avoidable project or venture challenges. These are all examples that I have either heard of or seen in practice. One common one is faculties misunderstanding their revenue sharing rights across a commercialization opportunity. I've seen one where an investor has not been made aware of a critical issue and hearing about it in the media. That goes back many pre-TTO years, but that does happen. Sometimes employers are not knowing that their team are involved in commercialisation activity. Sometimes hear of research teams starting down the commercialisation journey without involving the commercialisation team. And there's the old chestnut publishing before protecting, which can be a fraught little area too in this space. So recently I was listening to Beyond the Breakthrough, which is a podcast focusing on research commercialisation. If you haven't listened to it, it is really good. This particular episode was titled, "What are the most important skills that our spin-out founders need?" And the CEO of Biocartis Group, Herman Verhelst, he's an experienced serial entrepreneur. He successfully founded and sold 3 spin-outs out of Leuven University. He was basically saying, researchers need to consider their audience groups really early on. The quote that came from that, he was talking about research being a technology push, where you've got a concept, you develop it further till it's ready to hit the market. But in fact, every business textbook you read will tell you to go about it a different way. They talk about approaching the problem from a customer perspective. And he was trying to argue that it meant that research teams often start with a handicap when they go into the commercialization space because they're being focused on the technology and not the customer. And so I think this really summed up perfectly why researchers need to consider their audience groups. He's advocating getting to know your customer earlier in the process, and we're going to look at how you do that in today's webinar. Firstly, some definitions. Before we get to know the different customer group or audience groups, I'm going to use some commercially focused terms today, so I just want to take some time up front to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of those definitions, and I will provide this slide later on for you guys as well. So let's take a bit of a look across stakeholders. So those are the individuals, groups, companies, organizations that directly or indirectly support your research. Then we've got customers. They can be users of your knowledge or beneficiaries of your research. They can engage with you in multiple different ways. They may pay, they may consume, they may utilize. And then around our little Venn diagram, we've got audiences, which is basically everyone who's interested in what you're doing. So let's take a deeper dive into those 3 different areas. So stakeholder is a term you might not naturally use, but they're probably the easiest group for you to identify in terms of the work that you are doing. They're those critical individuals, or groups, institutions, or companies that have a direct interest in what you're doing. They'll fund or enable or support your work in some way. So no matter what stage you are at on that commercialization journey, you should be able to list your stakeholders, whether it's for your research or the project that you're commercializing or even your new venture. So I'll challenge you to have a think about who those groups or individuals might be later on. But why is it important to know who they are? Well, they support the day-to-day delivery of your work, right? So whether it's through financial support or advocacy or political capital, social license to operate, emotional support, time and mentoring, these elements are all critical to the success of your work. And so the key point here is they really need to know what's happening, right? They need to know what you're up to. That way they can do their job better for you. So in today's webinar, I'm going to look at 3 key stages across a commercialization journey. So at one end, we've got the research project. There's a pre-venture stage when you've identified and protected a technology that might be commercialized, and you're in the process of validating that. And then we've got at the other end, the new venture, where you're in the process of spinning something out. It's important to break it down this way because as you move through that journey or that project, your stakeholders will change and evolve. So let's take a look at some examples of stakeholders at the research project level. So you might, and this is a non-exhaustive list, it's just an example, your project will be unique to you, and so your stakeholder list will look unique to the work that you're doing. But you could have your institution leadership, your school and faculty, your research team, your funder, whoever is funding the work that you're doing. Your family, don't forget about them because, depending on where you're at in this journey, they may be wearing some heat as well. So just, they're a stakeholder. They need to know what's going on. Obviously, you have potentially collaborators in the mix as well. Then at the pre-venture stage, you might bring in some team members. You'll obviously want to involve your TTO or your commercialization team in the project as well. You might have a pre-seed funder involved at that stage and start to talk to industry partners and collaborators. Mentors are always a good idea. your employer, who, in whatever capacity you're commercializing, you hopefully will have an employer, so they need to know what's going on too. Finally, under new venture, some stakeholders might be investors, your early customers in the process. You might have to bring in regulatory or legislative stakeholders, depending on what you're actually doing. If you're doing a clinical trial, whoever's involved in that process, and your governance team, whatever that might look like at the stage that you're at. So as I said earlier, this is a non-exhaustive list. It will be unique to your project, but you will know who these people are, or these groups are, or these organizations are, because you're working with them and they all have skin in the game. So you should be able to sit down now and write a list of who your stakeholders are. If you do need some help finding some key stakeholders, I'm just going to do a callback to a webinar that we held back in May. It was a LinkedIn webinar. There's a really good sequence in there where Nick talks about using LinkedIn to find stakeholders as you're looking forward in your project. So I would really recommend that. Sorry, I haven't got the actual time stamps for that piece, but it's a good webinar anyway, so you should watch it. But there is a good piece around finding your stakeholders utilizing LinkedIn. Okay, before we move on from stakeholders, I just want to give you a quick example, an example that I think is really good from AgriFutures Australia, one of Australia's rural research and development corporations, is this shows they've got quite a complex stakeholder matrix, a stakeholder map, and they've used the different industries in this blue band in the centre to kind of identify who this key stakeholder groups are. And I think that there's a really nice approach. I just wanted to show this to you as another way to approach identifying your stakeholders. So maps it out pretty well, I think. Okay, so let's move on to customers, the users of your knowledge or potential beneficiaries of your research, those who are paying, consuming, or utilising. That's the definition we looked at the beginning. But the reality is, if you're working on any research that has real-world impact, you will have customers, whether you know who they are or not. If you establish early on who they are, you might be able to engage them in the process of research so that your work can genuinely create impact for those who need it. And by doing that, you're effectively reversing Herman Varel's comment from earlier in the slideshow, where he was talking about research being a technology push. If you've identified your customers and you've got them on the journey with you, well, you are customer-centric. You are focusing on what those customer opportunities are. So we're going to do a little bit of a run into some different ways of identifying customers, but one couple of things to keep in mind. They might be paying or they might be consumers. So they could be a primary customer or a secondary customer. The example I kind of use is the New Zealand government, for example, purchases pharmaceuticals for distribution throughout our population, depending on need. They are a primary customer to the pharmaceutical companies, but consumers who also purchase and utilise pharmaceuticals for whatever reason they need to are secondary customers in that example. So you've actually got a slightly more complex customer relationship to think about. Customers don't always stay the same. They can change over time as your research evolves, your venture evolves, and you understand more about what you're trying to deliver, or you hone in on your delivery. That customer group can shift. So keep that in mind, and that's okay. Your stakeholders can sometimes also be your customer too, so keep that in mind as well. You may already know some of your customers. How do you identify your customers? This diagram is adapted from Marketing Revolution, which is quite a good website resource. There are many different ways to identify customers and different versions of this out there, but I think this is a really good place to start. Good market validation is really critical, and it really helps you land who your customers are. So start to be thinking about how you're validating potential markets, even back in your research stage, if you think that you've got something that has got commercialization potential. You can talk to your partners, your stakeholders early on to understand and identify potential customers. But don't just leave it at that. Don't just identify who the customer group might be. Go out and actually talk to them, because putting my marketing hat on here, actually talking to your customers really helps you understand what's driving their needs and understanding the world that they live in and how your research solution might work in their world. So have those conversations. Think about the problem that your innovation might solve and who has that problem, and that will lead you directly to your customer groups. It's no good coming up with a world-changing innovation if you can't reach the people who need it the most, or they can't or won't use it in the way that you intended them to use it. So there's a couple of notorious examples from various ends of the spectrum. But I wanted today to look at different ways of thinking about your customers. In marketing, we call these segments. They come from a marketing perspective, but I am going to give some examples from the research and commercialization world. Each approach that we're going to go through, each one of these 7 segments, they're all worth a deeper dive. But obviously, we've limited time today, so I'm going to give some quite quick examples. So I will move through this section reasonably rapidly. Obviously, you can watch this webinar on post if you need to get a bit more information. As we work through the different segments, just have a think about what might apply to your own work and how these segments translate to your own customer identification. It's more than likely more than one category will be relevant to the work that you're doing. So, you can layer some complexity here with these groups. Okay, so demographic segmentation, most people know what that is. It focuses on population-related characteristics, income, education, age, etc. You can use multiple segmentation criteria to get very specific about who you want to target, such as that second example there, which is a project developing job-seeking benefit modelling data, and they were really targeted about who they wanted to talk to: unemployed men under 30 with year 12 qualifications who are currently seeking work. So you've got multiple demographic elements at play there to get quite a niche market, but that's one way we can have something as broad as pregnant people aged between 18 and 45 in the top example. Geographic segmentation, again, fairly obvious. It forces you to think about how your research or innovation might be applied in certain locations. It enables you to hone in on certain characteristics or specific characteristics that may be unique to that location, or there might be problems that are experienced by a particular region or area. So, for example, a really sensible place to test a flood early detection technology could be within that homeowner group located in eastern Australian river valleys, for example. Behavioural segmentation will segment customers by similar habits or behaviours, and it could be a really great and easy way to start pointing you directly to where you might find those customers. So in the first example here, we had a behavioural segment of Māori tribes who were collecting shellfish for kai moana or seafood. And it actually made it really, really easy to identify and locate those potential customers. The team was creating a rapid testing tool for testing the safety of that kai moana. And so, with a few phone calls and emails, they could quickly identify who they needed to be talking to. A technographic segment is a customer grouped by the technology that they use. So in both the examples here, you can see the corporate customer types for commercialization opportunities, but they were targeting a corporate customer, and they were defined by the hardware or software that they were using in market. And the case study that we're going to be looking at later on also looks at a pre-venture project that was working within a technographic segment as well. Okay, so a psychographic segment, it differs slightly from behavioural segments in that psychographic customers are defined more by their beliefs and their interests. These segments can actually be really challenging to identify and engage with, especially if you're dealing with a belief that's non-mainstream. Some members of a segmentation group might happily self-identify, whereas others might not want to, and so it can be quite tricky to get a quality sample in this space. Anti-vaxxers are a good example of this difficulty. Some will self-identify happily, and then others refuse to do so. So it's really challenging to actually get a broad segment to test a customer proposition. Those of you in the social sciences, I'm sure, will be adept at understanding and navigating these challenges in this segment. Firmographic segmentation is a variation on demographic, and it's becoming more popular, certainly in marketing, as you kind of see social media mainstreaming generation wars. Effectively, these segments are based on your generation, your boomers, your X's, your millennials, Gen Z, etc. You probably need to think carefully about whether you use or publicise the fact that you're using firmographic segmentation. Some generations, Gen Alpha, Gen Z, are not concerned about being labelled as such, but others might find it a little bit offensive. So you can obviously just use the generational bands as they've used there, where people born between 1945 and 1964 that own their own homes, rather than labelling them boomers, which might be a little bit offensive. And then finally, I wanted to just flag for you an alternative way to approach customer segmentation, which is called needs-based. And this can really resonate well when you think about the real-world problem that your research is solving, and you want to just seek customer groups that might experience that problem in a variety of ways. I came across both these examples when I was looking at climate-driven innovation, and they're good examples of where a regulatory requirement creates a need-based segment. So the top one is shipping companies who are having to shift off diesel to meet 2050 carbon targets. And the lower one is companies who are developing particle board products that need to meet the new EU formaldehyde regulations. So both those regs have created a new need and market that requires compliance. So that obviously creates new opportunities to solve solutions for those need-based groups. Okay, I know we've run through that really quickly, but hopefully none of that is earth-shatteringly new information to you. It's just perhaps a different way to think of who your customer might be. Let's say we now know who the customer is. Now what do you do? I haven't got time to do a detailed customer discovery process with you. That's probably a really good topic for another webinar. Ideally, that would form part of a market validation process, particularly when you're in a pre-venture phase of a project. You'd be working with your commercialization team to do market validation. Customer discovery is a really important part of that. I wanted to just flag for you that there is some really good information out there, and I really like Steve Blank's Customer Discovery Best Practice series on YouTube. I've got the search prompt there, but also we'll share a link later on. Steve's at Stanford, and this is a sales and marketing focus, but it really gets you in the right headspace for customer discovery. So if you are at that stage in your project, I'd really recommend just going and having a look. I think there's like 24, 25, what have I got here, 24 videos there. They're a couple of years old now, but absolutely stand the test of time. And just go and check them out. He speaks a lot of sense, and it would be really relevant for the work that you're doing. Okay, and before we move on from the customer group, I just want to emphasize a point that showed up recently on an email from Main Sequence, where they were zeroing in on getting to the customer earlier. They were focused on deep tech development, and the point that they made there was that getting it right means that if you get it right early, understanding who your customer is earlier in the deep tech commercialization journey, you'll increase engagement with your end product, and you'll increase potential customer satisfaction and loyalty. And I think, again, it can be challenging in deep tech because your lead time's so much longer to getting to market that to just forget about the customer, but you do actually want to start to get into a process of checking in with them and making sure that you're actually on the right track. Main Sequence have put together a deep tech customer interest ladder. It's providing guidance for customer engagement and re-engagement through the commercialization process. I think it's a really worthwhile resource, whether you are a researcher in this space or you're in a commercialization team. Please do go check it out. Okay, finally, audience groups. Audience is everyone else. Everyone else who's not a stakeholder or a customer, but is interested in what you're doing. And that interest is whether you want them to be interested or not. You might not communicate directly with these individuals, companies, organizations, but they could be watching what you're up to. So let's take a little bit of time to take a closer look at who they might be. Okay, so you've got your potentials first. Audience members who are in the potential category are people who are probably, and not necessarily people, but individuals, groups, companies who might be on your radar screen as potential future relationships. So if you understand your existing stakeholders really well, it'll help you identify who your potential partners, potential investors, buyers, customers, influencers might be. For example, if I'm partnering with a New Zealand education services company to distribute and sell an education tool, it stands to reason that their competitors in Australia might also be keeping an eye on the market for future opportunities, and therefore they could be part of your wider audience group. The imaginatively named others, they're audience members that might keep an eye on what you're up to. So if we think of that education tool example that I just ran through, say you do decide to enter the Australian market, you will need to talk to regulators most likely, right? And they'll do their due diligence on you. So they'll Google you, they'll Google the project to legitimize who you are. So they're part of the audience. And it's actually possible, if you think about the natural progression of your project in multiple different directions, to start to factor in who these groups might be from quite early on and ensure that your publicly facing messaging is actually really suitable for them as well. Then you've got the lurkers, which I think is imaginatively named because you could just imagine people kind of lurking in the background and keeping an eye on what you're up to. And competitors do sit in the space, especially once you're out into that venture stage and you've kind of gone public and you're out there, your competitors will immediately be lurking around looking at what you're up to. The media can sometimes be lurking too, particularly if something's going to go wrong. they'll definitely be lurking. Then you've got another group in here which are not interested until they are interested. I always load media into that group because it's sometimes really hard to get them to pay attention to what you're doing, particularly if you've got amazing progress you want to shout about and they're not interested. It's worth being aware that they're not going to be tracking your every move. Even if you've worked with them before, unless there's a problem, and then suddenly they will be interested and they will go back through public-facing information to kind of get a feel for who you are or what your project is. So the key to managing these audience groups, especially the ones you don't really know who they are, is to make sure that your public communications are always fit for every possible audience that may come across them. Ensure that whatever you put into the public domain is legally and factually compliant and true. Obviously, don't be shy about hyping the progress of your project once you can talk about it, but make sure you can talk about it. For those of you inside institutions, either Crown Research Institutes or universities, you guys will have a comms team. Utilise them. They're there to help, and they're much happier to help with stuff and be proactive with things than have to clean up a PR mess at the other end. So get your comms team involved earlier. In fact, they're a really valuable stakeholder. Okay, I am now going to talk about a project that I supported over several years at Wellington Univentures, and I'm going to use it to demonstrate how we develop an audience matrix and messaging for different stakeholders, customer groups and audience groups. So firstly, a bit of background on the project itself. The project came out of PhD research. They developed a machine learning tool to reliably predict changes on complex networks. They worked with their TTO on market validation, and the team were trying to identify networked markets where improved network resilience would create efficiencies and savings, especially as loads increased on those networks. So they were effectively looking for technographic customer groups, as we discussed in those audience groups earlier. They undertook initial network monitoring work with an electricity supply company, but this proved to be challenging, so they actually pivoted into traffic monitoring through a local council here in Wellington. And the tool could be used to predict locations where accidents are most likely to occur using network data from CCTV. A commercialisation opportunity was identified, and a local council partner was identified to develop a robust proof of concept. They undertook signing an MOU and started on a bit of a trial. So at this point, I just want to be full disclosure that this commercialisation opportunity didn't actually proceed to spin out in the end, even though that was part of what they were planning originally. The benefit of this is I can kind of give you a high quality example of audience identification without any commercial or confidentiality concerns that might accompany a new venture. So how do we go about identifying key stakeholders, customers, and audiences for this project? So we built an audience matrix for this case study. So let's do that again. We'll recreate it. For all the stakeholders, down the side on the left-hand side there, you've got your stakeholder groups, your customer groups, and your audiences. And then I've also gone ahead and split it over time. You might do it for the next phase in your project, but what I want to show you is how these stakeholders and customers and audiences change over time. And we'll make an assumption that it did proceed to new venture. We did actually create some or identify some new venture stakeholders and audiences as part of the process. So you can kind of see how that would have evolved. So you would normally focus where you're at a given time. So if you're still in research, you do your stakeholders and potential customers for that point in time, but your audiences will never be static in time. So consider future audiences. It's beneficial to think about who they might be as your project evolves. It's quite strategically focused and allows you to kind of look up and think forward as to what's coming next. Okay, so in the research project stage, the team worked with the faculty. They had a funding agency that was involved, obviously, and they had a few collaborators from within the university. The university leadership is a stakeholder with some interest in what they're doing. Obviously, they want research to be successful, so they have got that kind of overarching stakeholder view. There were also some audiences for the work that they were doing at that stage. Peers across the university and potentially other universities might have been slightly interested in what they were up to. And the commercialisation team that I was working with, were always keeping an eye on what research was coming through that might have an IP position. And so they're an audience. They're keeping an eye. They haven't got skin in the game yet, but they are there keeping an eye. At the pre-venture stage, it's really important to note that the stakeholders stay the same. Their level of interest might shift depending on where you are at the stage, but they're still part of the mix. But we also bring new stakeholders in. As they started being involved in the actual commercialisation process, they moved from being an audience member to a stakeholder. And during that pre-venture stage, they also identified the potential partner, the local council. And they'd signed that MOU, so they became a stakeholder in the project. The audience group expanded as well, so that potential partners they were always looking ahead as to who the potential partners might be. They identified logistics companies as potential customer groups as well, and electricity line networks as well. Investors at this stage also became an audience group. Then so again, we're projecting here, if we had moved into a new venture stage, the stakeholders would have stayed the same, but they would have added regulatory bodies. There was some health and safety legislation and accident compensation legislation in New Zealand that was at play here. Privacy obviously is also an issue, so there were some regulatory bodies that would have needed to be in the mix. Investors would have become a stakeholder at that point too, had they spun out. They were thinking about additional customer groups coming on in the council groups. And then at that point, we were kind of visualizing what an audience group might look like, and they were adding in merger and acquisition scouts very ambitiously. Other future markets, both here in New Zealand and offshore, competitors would also come in as an audience group at that point. Okay, so once we know who our audience groups are, how can we use that insight to develop more sophisticated communications and help drive forward your purpose and achieve the outcomes you desire? My friend Simon Sinek says communication is not about speaking what we think. Communication is about ensuring others hear what we mean. So what does that actually look like in practice? We're going to look at messaging to demonstrate how your understanding of your different audience groups can help you tailor messaging that will resonate specifically with them. I think of messaging always as yin and yang, opposite but inherently interconnected. So on one side, on the left-hand side, we've got us, and we're thinking about what is it that we want them to know, think, or do. We've got the messages, we've got the information, we've got the value proposition, the call to action. On the other side, we've got our rather likely self-absorbed audience groups. They are inherently self-absorbed. Think about yourself and everything that's going on in your life. For you to hear messages that resonate with you, you want to see something in it for you. Otherwise, why would you take in that information? So when we craft strong messaging as part of our communications, we need to think about both sides of this equation. Then we have to think about some elements to our messaging as well. So your understanding of those different audience groups will help you tailor the messaging so it resonates specifically with them. And it doesn't matter what stage you're at in your research or who your audience is, this approach will sharpen all your communications. On the commercialization journey, your customer messaging should fall out of your market validation because you know who your customers are and you understand what's important to them. You should also know who your stakeholders are, as we've already discussed. And if you've got good quality relationships with those stakeholders, you'll also understand what's important to them. So we can consider 4 elements: clarity, consistency, relevance, distinctiveness. Try to imbibe all your messaging with these elements as it relates to the specific audience group. And then that ensures that you're telling them what they need to know and do in a way that they will understand and feel motivated about. The converse of that, the opposite of that, is telling them what you want them to know because it's important to you. And that is not necessarily going to land. So let's have a quick look now at how we can apply messaging to some of these key stakeholders from that pre-venture stage in the case study. And so I've circled 3 different stakeholder groups that I want to just do a bit of a deeper dive into, and bear with me on this. I think it's really valuable. I'll do some reading of quotes and things to help you understand how some of the messaging that we used in this project and how we adapted the messaging to the different audiences and utilized that consistency, clarity, relevance, distinctiveness. This is a little bit of comms and PR 101, but I really hope it will be valuable to show how carefully considering your messaging can drive more effective engagement and all those downstream outcomes that you really want to happen. Okay, so the first step in messaging is to look at each of the audience groups and use your knowledge of them to document what's important. Now, you don't need a matrix to do this. You can scribble it on the back of a napkin, but you want to think about what's important to them now and in the future. And if you can't answer the question, what's important to this audience group, you need to go back a step and talk to them. So in this example, I'm just using a couple of high-level points per audience member, but your due diligence will probably show more things that are important. So for local council, they were interested in risk management. They were interested in cost containment and they wanted to meet their strategic objectives. Those were the three things that were critically important to them. Our investors, on the other hand, they were wanting early relationships. They wanted early influence and they wanted a competitive advantage. So to engage with us, that was what they were looking for. Finally, the third audience that I'm going to take a little closer look at is our commercialisation teams. They wanted to get involved early. They wanted full information and they wanted the opportunity to engage. So that's what's important to that commercialisation team. Okay. So thinking first about a partner such as the local council, based on what we knew about them and what we wanted to achieve, the key messages were things like the following. So our technology could help you identify significant traffic issues before they occur, enabling you to undertake remedial work and avoid cost, disruption, and injury. Second message, we'd like to partner with you to test the technology in a real-world scenario. Third message, the opportunity to be involved in a proof of concept trial fits with your strategy of being a 21st century city and positions you as a leader among your national and international peers. Okay, so we have got a call to action in there. We have expressly outlined what we need from the stakeholder. We want to partner with them. Then we've gone in and said what's in it for them. So we're focused in on that cost and risk mitigation element that I looked at earlier. So you want to clearly weave in why the stakeholder should be interested. Hopefully they are interested in what you're talking about, but sometimes you need to spell it out really clearly for them. Clarity. So we're talking about clear use of language. It's really important, especially as a lot of you will be doing, you're communicating complex concepts to lay people. Try to use plain English and focus on the impact and outcomes rather than the technical details, especially when you're starting out. So there'll be plenty of time to deep dive later and explain all the magic that goes into creating your invention and how it works. But do that later once they understand what's needed from them, rather than bombarding them with complexity at the outset. Highlighting a distinctive element in your message, it helps it stand out, creates memorability. And here we're talking about being involved in the proof of concept, fitting their strategy of being a 21st century city, appealing to the ego of being a leader amongst their peers. We outline the opportunity by honing in on the unique benefits of engaging. Finally, messaging is relevant if it focuses on what's important to the audience and not to you, as I was saying earlier. So it's about what's important to them. Here we've demonstrated that we understand their strategic direction. We've read it, we understand it, and we know how the call to action speaks to their strategy. So it's directly relevant to them. We're making it hard for them to say no. Okay, moving on. The next pre-venture stakeholder group are investors. It's really actually still relatively uncommon to get them really, really involved early in the pre-venture stage, but there are some distinct advantages to both parties to do it. They want to be involved earlier and earlier in the process. So we were aware of this, our commercialisation team was aware of this, and in this project, they had the following key messages. The first one is, while it is early, we are looking for investor interest in our technology while we work hard to de-risk it. Feedback from the investment community at this early stage enables us to take their needs into account and develop a stronger investment proposition when we go to market. Your early engagement will enable you to develop deeper understanding and higher levels of comfort with our technology and value proposition. So those are the messages that we documented, the call to action. We're clearly stating up front what we're looking for. We're looking for investor interest in our technology. So don't be afraid to be explicit with your call to action. You don't need to be demanding, but you can be explicit with what you want and what you need. This enables your audience to be really clear about what they're signing up for, and it helps support their decision-making when clarity is there. When we look at what's in it for them, it's your opportunity to demonstrate you've done your homework, particularly with this investor group, and you know what's important to them. So, we can take the investor needs into account as we're developing the project, and their early engagement will help them understand a deeper understanding of what we're doing and a higher level of comfort with our value prop and our technology. So this actually helps you stand out from others. This is a highly competitive space when you're looking for funding, and so this helps you stand out. Consistent messaging. It's critical to building trust and confidence. It demonstrates that you know what you're doing and that you're competent. So take a critical eye to your messaging through all mediums and make sure you're maintaining consistency. If you have to change a message at some point, which we do sometimes, and that's fine, but you just need to explain why. So you're suddenly veering and changing strategic direction. Make sure you frame that in a way that people understand why you're doing that. We're consistently talking about early engagement, early engagement, early engagement, saying it in different ways, but repeating it. Right, so we know it's not as common to engage investors early in the pre-venture stage. So we're highlighting that we understand why we would do that and why that's important to the investor. It's another really great way to distinguish yourself from competitors and enable investors to come in early and I guess stand out from your competitors in that space. Okay, last one, I promise. Commercialization office. It's our last pre-venture stakeholder group that I want to take a look at. And I really want to focus for a minute here because the commercialization team, whether it's a TTO in a university or a commercialization manager in a research institution, they can be your biggest cheerleader. I've seen a lot of relationships go sideways due to miscommunication. So I would really encourage you to think about what you want the relationship with your commercialization team to be like and share that with them. And commercialization professionals, I'd encourage you to do the same. In this project, we didn't formally document messages for commercialization teams. The ones that you've got written on the screen there, I've made up to reflect the way that relationship actually worked in practice. It was a really good one. But we could summarize the relationship in the following ways. We want a trusting relationship with the commercialization team, and we welcome the commercialization team to join our project to help move the project through the commercialization journey. We undertake to communicate key milestones clearly and advise of significant roadblocks as early as possible. We'll involve our commercialization team to resolve issues or help us pursue opportunities early. Early and open communication is key to it. So our call to action outlines how the project team worked with the commercialization team in practice. We didn't document these, but we had undertaken to get them involved along the whole journey. Consider what you want your relationship with the commercialization team to look like, what you want them to bring to the project, and then write it down. Commit to it. The what's in it for them is communicated using consistent language. It outlines an open relationship and it enables quick problem identification and quick pursuit of opportunities to the extent that that can happen. And here we've got clear and relevant outlines of what a relationship could or should look like. I think the value in writing it down is that you can form a commitment from both parties to work towards a common goal here. Obviously, commercialization is potentially the common goal, but the relationship is what drives that commercialization process. So if you're in a commercialization team and you're on the call today, you might like to consider whether you want to support project teams to really think through what they want from that commercialization relationship right at the start of when you start working together. If you do want more information about this, Campus Plus do have a hands-on workshop called Communication for Commercialization, and that helps commercialization professionals work through communications approaches for working with different types of researchers to support their ambition for their research in the most effective way. Okay. Time check. Right, we're good. All right, so a quick summary of learning before we hop into some questions and answers if you do have any. So today we've talked about the differences between a stakeholder, a customer, and your wider audiences. Hopefully now you kind of understand why it's important to identify them and some tips on how to identify them. We've talked about an audience matrix and how you might want to complete that for your research or your project or event so that you can kind of identify and note who your stakeholders, customers, and audiences are. And we've done a bit of a deeper dive into messaging and why this is important. So I hope that that's been of value to you guys, and I'm happy to take any questions if there happen to be any.
Thanks, Becky.